All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Good morning. This is Sarah Adaris. I'm a Senior Policy Associate here with the Climate and Energy Program at the Nicholas Institute. Joined this morning by Martin Ross, lead author of the recently released Modeling Analysis, Ongoing Evolution of the Electricity Industry, Effects of Market Conditions, and the Clean Power Plan on States. We also have Martin's co-authors, Brian Murray, Director of Economic Analysis here at the Nicholas Institute, and Dave Hoppick, a Senior Policy Associate in the Climate and Energy Program, on the line. I'm going to pass the microphone to Martin in just a minute, but before I do, I wanted to take care of just a few housekeeping items for this morning. So first, I just want to note that we are recording this presentation this morning. It'll be available on our website. Usually it takes us a few days, and we'll also post the slides online at that time. So if you want to go back and review any of the slides or review any part of the presentation, those will be posted to our website. Second, we encourage you to ask a question at any time throughout the webinar. You can do so by typing into the chat box to the Nicholas Institute or the host. And that chat box you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen if you're not in full screen mode. And if you are in full screen mode, then you hover over the little bar at the top of your screen, and then you'll have a chat option there. You can also tweet to us this morning, hashtag NIEPS Live, NIEPS Live, as in Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. And if you ask a question, a clarifying question, I'll pose it to Martin in real time if you're quick at the draw, and all other questions we'll save for the end of the presentation. And when we get to the end of the presentation in the Q&A portion, I will unmute Martin's co-authors so that they can join in the conversation at that time, and we'll stop the recording. So unless Martin has anything to add housekeeping-wise, we'll dive right in.
All right, sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining us. So what I'm going to, well, the picture isn't showing up. What I'm going to do today is sort of, like Sarah said, go over the recent paper. We've done a couple of other analyses that are listed on this slide of the older proposal for the Clean Power Plan and some previous work to that as well. But what we're going to go over today is the report that was released last week. Had to do some picking and choosing in terms of trying to fit the report, which ended up being quite a bit longer than I intended, trying to fit that into an hour or so. And even within the report itself, since we were trying to look at a pretty wide range of market conditions and this notion of patchwork choices by states, what are states potentially going to be inclined to do? There's certainly picking and choosing that we had to do there, but try to at least cover the basics today, and then you can always ask questions or look at some of the more details in the report. So I'll try to summarize what the report says at a very high level, then very briefly go over the DIEM model that we have constructed to take a look at this and the various sensitivities that we examined, and then sort of dive into results, starting with sort of baseline trends in the industry just to set the stage, and then moving into first sort of a coordinated national approach to the Clean Power Plan that helps to illustrate some points that we wanted to take a look at, and then get into this notion of states choosing a variety of different options rather than adopting a coordinated approach, and then briefly summarize some of the sensitivities and conclusions. So highlights of analysis, fairly obvious, I would think at this point. Gas prices are really a big driving factor in both your baseline emissions without the policy, and then what happens to the clean power plant policy costs and emissions. I know there's certainly other things that are important too in terms of renewables and energy efficiency, and we'll get into those a bit, but gas prices are definitely a very large driving factor. Broadly, costs for the clean power plant are, relatively low, at a national level. The mass cap of the existing units is certainly the cheapest option amongst those that were laid out by EPA in the final rule last summer. The new source complement and a dual rate where you have a rate for coal plants and another emissions rate for gas plants have fairly similar costs. I guess one broad conclusion is that there may not be sort of a single best answer for all the states, and even within the states, the best approach may depend on market conditions. Some states are going to sort of clearly be better off under one approach than another. For many states, though, it's really going to matter quite a bit what your neighbors choose to do. And just to note that I certainly would use caution when you're sort of interpreting results out of these types of models, at the state level. I'll come back to some of those thoughts as we go through things. Costs can vary significantly by state, and sort of when I'm, what we've really focused on here in terms of costs are really the cost of supplying electricity to the grid. So it's really, from an industry perspective, what does it cost to run the existing units? What does it cost to build new units? What might it cost to get electricity in and out of a state? What benefits a state might receive from, potentially selling ERCs, emission rate credits generated by, building wind units, that sort of thing. We sort of planned on doing more on the, consumer side in terms of, like retail prices or whatever the case may be, but really didn't focus on them here just because, the costs are low enough that, there's really not particularly interesting stories going on, that, give you significantly different answers than, the cost that we'll sort of go over today. So some states are going to benefit from being in position to sell ERCs. Some states are going to experience costs from the policies. And, a lot of that is going to sort of vary depending on the breadth of the markets, the trading markets for these notions of ERCs, the emissions rate credits, or the mass allowances for states that are choosing to go with one of the mass cap options. And I would note broadly at the beginning that the mass-based options, seem to have a narrower range of costs than the emissions rate approaches across a fairly wide range of potential future market conditions. So the model that we're using to take a look at these things, the DIEM model, a fairly standard, linear programming electricity dispatch model, similar to, in logical structure to IPM, the NREL model, the RFF haiku model, sort of minimizes the cost of supplying electricity to the grid subject to meeting the various policy constraints and whatnot that are, in the system at the moment. Historical data from NEEDS, the IPM NEEDS database, and other places. And just wanted to note that a fair number of things, efficiency retrofits, energy efficiency, building new renewables, all those sorts of things are endogenous choices in the model. They're not sort of forced on to the model. And the model can choose to do such things in both the baseline case and the policy cases. Wanted to go through a few of the important assumptions prior to diving into the results, because it, like I said, we really did try to focus a lot on the sensitivities and get a broader sense for what was going on with the model and potential future outcomes. So first of all, I just wanted to point out that we have included the federal extension to renewable PTC, ITC. Many of the assumptions in terms of electricity demands and some of the capital costs and fuel prices are driven by what was in the Annual Energy Outlook 2015. I've got a bunch of adjustments to those on the next slide I'll go over. We started with the EPA assumptions on energy efficiency in terms of their costs and availability. These runs sort of assume in the long term that the nuclear plants are sticking around. They're not forced to stick around, but they are allowed to. That doesn't really factor in too much in terms of, if we're looking at results through 2030, what nuclear plants starting to retire in 2035 and thereon aren't affecting the short-term results too much. We're not really seeing maybe too much in the way of short-term economic retirements of the nuclear plants. And I just wanted to point out that, sort of banking and borrowing of IRCs and allowances over the first 8 years of the policy, and then thereafter sort of the policy is like an ongoing target for the states. The natural gas prices that we are using sort of defined a high, medium, and low case, where the high case was actually the reference case out of the 2015 Annual Energy Outlook. The low case was the high resource case, and then the medium case, which is sort of the standard assumption, was halfway in between. So that if you're trying to compare this to, well, it does end up matching up fairly nicely with what is in the AEO 2016, which factors in some of the more recent changes in natural gas markets, price declines and whatnot. And it also is similar to what the Bipartisan Policy Center used in their analysis. The standard assumption for renewables costs was from the EPA analysis of the Clean Power Plan. Those are in red in that middle table. And then for a sensitivity, looked at sort of the NRAIL assumptions out of their annual technology baseline for their low cost price case. Did a variety of electricity demands. The AEO reference has demand growing nationally at less than 1% a year. We looked at sort of low, medium, and high cases around that. And we also looked at sort of low, medium, and higher, availability of energy efficiency around the EPA assumptions. So really looking at things at a state level, but some of the charts and some of the stuff in the paper has some regional grouping, so I at least wanted to toss up this map of sort of the regional definition, so you just generally see what was defined as southeast versus east central versus north central, that sort of thing. So taking a look at some of the baseline trends in the industry, as estimated in the model without the Clean Power Plan. As I mentioned, sort of, really the critical thing for CO2 emissions is what happens with gas prices in the future. So if you're looking at, a moderate or medium case gas prices, that really is going to leave the industry emissions, fairly near where they are today, as the industry sort of continues moving from coal into gas and renewables. If gas prices end up, staying lower than that forecast, basically, sort of where they are today, flat going forward, then you would see fairly significant declines in emissions even without the Clean Power Plan. So like I said, if these gas prices really are sort of below $4 per million BTU, you do see fairly significant shifts in the generation mix. Into gas and out of coal, whereas high gas prices would reverse these trends. The high gas prices also would lead to more renewables. Low gas prices can potentially outcompete renewables in the baseline. Because of these baseline trends, as other folks have shown in some of their work as well, the Clean Power Plan may not be binding initially, at least in some regions. That is somewhat dependent on the region. I think like the Southeast is sort of more inclined to have binding constraints, other regions less so. We don't see this sort of extending beyond the first few years of the policy, unless gas prices are lower than the mid-range forecasts. And what's going on with renewables in the baseline really depends, well, first of all, on that extension to the federal tax credits. That does get you some initial action over the next 5-6 years or so, an extra number of gigawatts there. Those effects will fade out if there aren't any sort of continued extensions of those credits. You do see some additional wind coming in as costs come down, and the sort of the effectiveness of the units increases. The solar utility scale solar PV needs to decline a bit more from the levels of those EPA assumptions. To really be cost effective in the baseline on a major scale. The NREL sort of low price assumptions for the renewables would certainly bring in more solar quicker in the baseline. So I just want to quickly take a look at the baseline emissions under some alternate assumptions. So here's sort of the basic baseline forecast, but the standard assumptions, medium gas prices, electricity demand growth of 0.7%, that sort of thing. That is with sort of the energy efficiency measures that are just in the annual energy outlook. Then if we bring in the EPA assumptions on energy efficiency and allow the model to choose those in the baseline, then you get this dashed line where with the energy efficiency, there's electricity demand is lower and therefore emissions are lower. If you have a high gas price case, that leads to higher emissions, just naturally. The low gas price case gives you a fairly significant drop in emissions right away, although they do tend to go back up a bit over time. If there's high electricity demand, so that's like whatever that was, an extra 0.5% growth per year, that would lead to fairly substantial increases in emissions from the industry compared with some of the other standard assumptions. And then if you just quickly compare those to the Clean Power Plan emissions goals for the two mass cap over existing units, or the mass cap including the new source complement, you can sort of see how those match up. Baseline generation behind those emissions, taking a look at sort of coal on the horizontal axis and natural gas on the vertical axis in terawatt hours. So basically, that covers the majority of the fossil generation in the industry. And then, if you see both coal and gas going down, you can sort of assume that that is made up by renewable generation.
Martin, just to clarify, this is in the year 2030, is that right?
Yes, sorry. I managed to leave that off. Yes, this is 2030, so sort of the first year the policy is in full effect. So for the standard set of assumptions, without the energy efficiency, in the baseline you've got sort of still a coal-heavy mix, not as heavy as today, but still a fair amount of coal in the baseline. And then, certainly, but, more gas than you would see today, not significantly more, but more, versus if you have a high gas price case, that sort of shifts you from, 1,500 terawatt hours of coal generation up closer to 1,700 terawatt hours, and with a sort of corresponding drop in gas generation on the vertical axis. Versus the low gas price case, where gas prices sort of stay around $3.50, $3.75 per million BTU out through 2030, if I recall correctly. That leads to a significant drop in gas from 1,500 down below 1,200 terawatt hours. Some of which is made up for with that increase in the gas generation, going up there. So to quickly go through some of these other ones, so this blue dot is if you have a low renewables cost. Basically, what this is suggesting is if you compare the black square and the blue dot, suggests that the renewables, extra renewables from lower cost renewables are coming out of gas generation, not sort of the existing coal fleet. If you have low gas prices and or low renewables costs, you get somewhat similar story. High, medium, and low electricity demand sort of shows, looking across that range of triangles there, really the main story is that if you've got high electricity demand, that's really going to be provided by a fair amount of new gas going forward through 2030 here. And then taking a look at high, medium, and low energy efficiency measures. So, that's sort of, medium would be the EPA assumption of, reducing electricity demand by 1% per year off of the previous year's demand, whereas what's called high is 1.5% per year off of demand, and low is 0.5% per year off of demand. That sort of shifts you down sort of similarly out of both coal and gas generation in response to the lower demand levels as the result of the additional energy efficiency measures. So let me keep moving along since got a ways to go. So we're sort of focusing on 3 of the policy options that EPA laid out. The rate-based case where you have dual rates or sort of subcategorized coal rates versus natural gas rates, technically fossil steam versus NGCC rates. The model has the various ERCs that can be generated under those rate-based systems from, gas shift ERCs, renewables, energy efficiency, all that sort of thing. Then there are the 2 mass-based approaches, the one over the existing units and the one that includes all units, essentially all units, including new units, which is the new source complement. And I would point out that we've sort of assumed that the mass states are not selling ERCs into rate-based states for the patchwork policies. You can potentially go either way on that assumption. So we sort of start with a coordinated national approach to the plan, with the exception that we sort of assume that California is always sort of off doing its own thing and meeting the new source complement by itself, and that the RGGI states are sort of adopting the new source complement as a group and trading amongst themselves, unless the rest of the nation goes with the new source complement as well, in which case we assume that RGGI is willing to then trade with other states adopting the new source complement. And after the national stuff, then we'll go through some of these patchwork choices where different states are making different choices, and take a look at some of the motivations that might lead states to do that, and then briefly talk about some of the alternative assumptions that are in the analysis. So highlights for the national sort of coordinated approaches to the Clean Power Plan. I'd say the basic story really is that we're talking about relatively low costs. I mean, we're talking sort of less than 1%, depending on exactly how the policy is approached. As I mentioned, the mass with the new source complement has policy costs that are fairly similar to the dual emissions rate approach. The mass cap over just the existing units certainly has the lowest policy costs that also achieves the fewest emissions reductions. And just in general, the prices for the mass allowances and the ERCs coming out of these policies are quite low and potentially zero in a fair number of years. As I mentioned broadly, I think it's important to note that the mass-based options are appearing to be less sensitive to sort of future assumptions about the industry than the rate-based options do, and we'll go through some of that. The gas prices do have a large effect on the policy costs. Low gas prices can reduce the policy costs to almost zero, whereas high gas prices could lead to more noticeable costs for the industry for sure, on the order of 3 or more % increase in sort of general operating costs for the industry as a whole. Energy efficiency measures are certainly going to be important for containing these costs. And we'll briefly talk about how, the leakage of emissions through shifts in generations is certainly an important factor. I think, this has appeared in other work as well, particularly the RFF analysis. The mass cap that's just over the existing units, potentially has emissions that are 7% higher in 2030 than the new source complement emissions cap that would cover most all of the things. And the output-based allocations and the renewable set-asides that go along with the cap over the just the existing units are not really affecting this notion of leakage of emissions from existing units into new units very much. The dual rate for the sort of standard set of assumptions has emissions that are fairly similar to the new source complement that was also seen in the EPA analysis of the rule, but those can vary quite a bit depending on future market conditions. And sorry, my little note there was that, as I said, in terms of, we're taking a somewhat conservative approach when we define these, policy costs by allowing the model to adopt energy efficiency measures in the baseline. If those energy efficiency measures save money in the baseline, then they're also saving money in the policy case, and but those cost savings, would not sort of show up as being reported as a policy cost saving because they're already sort of rolled into the baseline in the model. So it's going to give you a higher cost estimate in some sense than if you excluded the energy efficiency measures from the baseline, assuming those energy efficiency measures are available at prices that are lower than the cost of the electricity that they replace.
Martin, can you go back and just review how we're defining leakage for the purposes of this analysis?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to come to that with the graphs, but yeah, so I was defining leakage as the difference between like the mass cap over the existing units versus what is defined as the new source complement. And then similar for the dual, if we're looking at a leakage under a dual rate approach, that's also compared with the mass cap for the new source complement.
And the reason for doing that is because it's a static baseline to compare.
Yeah, it's just, like I say, it's a baseline. It's an emissions cap that's not dependent on any assumptions in our model. It's just the emissions cap that was defined by EPA in the final rule. So starting with emissions under some of these alternative, policy assumptions this time. So this is back to that original baseline, now looking through 2040. This is the baseline when you add in the energy efficiency measures. Then if you have the mass cap over the existing units, you see that emissions are down, but down by sort of a similar amount to what was provided by the energy efficiency measures. The mass cap over all units, which includes the new source complement, then gives you lower emissions than that, and so the difference between those two, as we were just discussing, would sort of be that notion of leakage, where the mass cap over the existing units has higher emissions than the mass cap over all units with the new source complement. And then the dual rate approach. So through 2030, that gives you, for the standard set of assumptions, fairly similar emissions to the new source complement. But then you can see that, even for the standard set of assumptions, post 2030, an emissions rate approach, sort of allows for growth in electricity. As electricity demand grows, you can then bring on more new gas units or whatever else to supply that demand, and emissions start going back up. There's also other minor things going on there, like starting around 2035 for the EPA set of assumptions on solar PV costs, they become cost effective in the baseline, leading to that sort of decline in emissions in the baseline. And that then factors into the dual rate level of emissions as well, because those renewables are available to supply emissions credits that can be used by coal plants, which then can run a bit more than they did, say in 2030 prior to those renewables coming online. Okay, this is going to be a graph with a lot of data points on it, just so you know. But so this is taking a look at the policy costs for the Clean Power Plan as measured in present value terms through 2040. You could measure, the models always think in sort of present value terms when they're trying to minimize these costs of a policy. But then it's a bit of a question, what's the most useful metric to present those costs? 2040 seemed to provide, the most consistent set of cost assumptions that, factors in, like construction that occurs in 2030 to meet the policy. So that's why we've gone with that particular notion there. So it's really policy costs, which would be like sort of percentage change in capital costs for new units, operating costs for new and existing units, fuel costs for new and existing units, and then at a regional level, any notion of, either imports or exports of emissions rate credits or mass allowances in and out of these various regions that are listed along the bottom of the graph. So, like I said, so the horizontal axis is percentage change in sort of overall national costs across the range of assumptions, the standard assumptions to start out with, and then low gas price, high gas price, as it's sort of listed there. So for the nation as a whole, like the very left-hand dot there, being close to zero, that is the cost of the mass cap over the existing units for the nation as a whole. So that's like the 0.1% cost increase for that policy. Then in the middle of the graph, under that same standard assumptions, column is the cost for the mass over all units, the mass with the new source complement. So that's getting up whatever, 0.7, 0.8% cost increase for the industry. And then on the right-hand set of the graph, the rate, dual rate thing under the standard assumptions is the emissions, the cost increase for that, getting up closer to 1% for the dual rate approach. And then if you look across within each of those three policy categories, you can sort of see how the costs vary as you vary some of the assumptions in the model, where really the outlying most dramatic effect is really from the higher gas prices. That really is the one that sort of obviously would increase the policy costs. For the mass over all units, some other ones, high electricity demand or low energy efficiency availability also is going to play an important factor in the policy costs. And, somewhat similar in terms of a rate-based approach, the low availability of energy efficiency way over on the right-hand side of the graph. You'll see the cost increase there because, if you have low energy efficiency availability, then, they're not going to be around to generate ERCs that could be used to meet the policy goals, and that certainly affects that rate-based approach to the policy.
All right, so we've got a couple of questions about what's included when we're talking about policy costs. So first question was, and what's included in the renewable cost? Does that include any cost for transmission or storage or anything beyond the overnight capital costs?
It includes, it includes the construction operating costs and, like I say, the transmission costs. We've not attempted to we've not really factored in storage, I guess, to go along with those units. So this would be sort of units without additional, battery backup as far as that goes in the costs. So potentially, depending on what you wanted to assume about storage costs, you could see more renewables coming in as the model tries to, smooth, the availability of the renewable electricity across the hours of the day.
Great. And then the second question was related. These are power sector costs, to be specific. They're not including any kind of macroeconomic effects or public health benefits or anything.
That's true. Yeah. And just specifically the costs to the industry, not even factoring in the consumer side of things. But yeah, no macroeconomic effects. We could potentially take a look at that at some point. These costs are all, for most cases, low enough that on a macro scale they're not going to show up much. Some depending on what happens with gas prices, that could change a bit, obviously. And then I probably at least won't try to go through all these dots in detail, but this whole next batch of dots, which is in the paper, sort of shows you the around the U.S. average for each of those policy cost estimates, what the sort of regional dispersion is. And we don't really have time to go through all of that, but I'd say again, one of the bigger takeaways is that the natural gas prices will cause the biggest variation across the country in where the costs occur, regardless of which of the three policy options you choose. And then there's some other interesting stuff in terms of like you can see on the dual rate thing on the right hand side of the graph, the green dots for the South Central, where they are experiencing benefits from building extra wind units and selling the ERCs and selling the electricity into other regions of the country in this sort of national approach where they can sell those ERCs fairly broadly. But we're running slow on time. Let me jump into that notion of leakage just quickly. So this is for the mass cap of the existing units, and again, comparing back to that new source complement level. So for the standard set of assumptions, so this is millions of tons up the the vertical axis, and then a variety of sensitivities across the horizontal axis. So you can see where for the standard set of assumptions, you're talking emissions of anywhere up to 100 or so million tons per year by 2030, more under the cap over the existing units than you had in the new source complement. The next three sets of groups, sort of show what happens to that if you change your assumptions about electricity demand. Again, obviously, if electricity demand is high and you're meeting that high electricity demand by building new gas units, then you're going to see a lot more of this emissions leakage under a cap over the existing units that does not cover those new gas units that would be supplying that electricity to meet the higher demand. High gas prices, actually send you in the other direction. Low gas prices can result in a bit more leakage, fairly complicated story there, so let me just move on. Renewables costs, if you have lower renewables costs, it doesn't affect the leakage too much in this cap over the existing units. But if you have low availability of energy efficiency, it generally leads to more leakage, and the reverse would be true if you have higher availability of energy efficiency. And this is a similar graph for the a national approach to the dual rate coal gas rate emissions targets compared with the new source complement. Don't want to go through all of these data points, but I'd say the takeaway here really is that, so on the left-hand side of the graph is the standard set of assumptions in the model that shows essentially no difference in emissions between the emissions rate approach and the new source complement. But the main point here really being that result depends on that specific set of assumptions, and if you vary those assumptions, leakage can be either higher or lower than that, depending on how things go. Oh, we're on time. Better move along to get to the state level stuff. So, just want to point out there's a fairly wide range of things that the state level cost estimates are going to depend on. And I did want to point out, I may not go through all these in detail, but there are, I would like you to use caution when you sort of think about costs coming out of these models at the state level. We have to make a variety of assumptions about how to assign those costs to states, and also assign the benefits of things like if a wind plant is built in a state, we're assigning the benefits from selling ERCs from that wind unit to the state in which it is built. We're not sort of trying to decide, like if a utility is operating across multiple state boundaries, how it might choose to, spread any costs of building a wind unit versus benefits from selling those ERCs across its service territory. And, well, just want to note that I won't necessarily have an answer for every single data point on some of the slides we will hopefully get to. And so just as a general result, keep in mind, these policy costs are going to vary a lot across states. I think that's one of the big takeaways. Some states are going to sort of obviously be better off with one approach than another. Some states are actually going to be better off than they were in the baseline case without the Clean Power Plan if they're exporting more electricity at prices above what it costs them to generate it, or if they're producing ERCs for more than it costs them to produce the ERCs, that sort of thing. Other states are going to be a bit less clear in terms of their answers, and it'll depend on the future conditions in the market. So, again, sort of going through some of these policy costs in percentage change terms, starting with the mass cap over the existing units. You won't really want to go through stuff in detail here, but you can sort of see how the costs, for this mass cap over existing units, there's not a huge dispersion in costs across states, but you will see some things where, like, I don't know, neighboring states where North Carolina is experiencing costs and South Carolina has some benefits from, variety of things going on in the state in terms of their under construction nuclear and whatnot. It's possible that, those costs might be sort of smoothed across those two states if they're in the same, sort of Duke service area, Duke energy area. Keep that in mind. So if you sort of roughly keep an eye on those costs and then take a look at the similar table for the new source complement, you can see sort of switching back and forth between the two, how the costs across the states, well, first of all, the new source complement overall units is a bit more costly than the cap over the existing units, and also there's a bit broader dispersion across the states in terms of where these costs occur. So the national average sort of hides a bit more of what's going on at the state level when you start getting into that new source complement approach. And then finally, a similar thing for the dual rate emissions rate goal approach. Here you can see, in some cases you can see like very obvious winners and losers for this approach. Like West Virginia should obviously, never go with an emissions rate approach versus a mass target according to the modeling. They're sort of coal heavy. It would be hard to meet this emissions rate target, and if they chose to go that route, even with a sort of coordinated national trading approach, they would have to rely on it would be difficult to make adjustments within the state, so they would be purchasing ERCs in order to meet an emissions rate goal. And you can see some certainly similar things in some of the states out west. Other states in the east are closer to where they were at in terms of the other two mass approaches. My apologies for switching back and forth so quickly, but hopefully you may have the tape or the paper in front of you as well. But really what we were doing with these national coordinated approaches was to just try to figure out what might make sense at the state level. What might they be inclined to choose? Who might go rate, who might go mass, There's sort of like an infinite number of these patchwork options that we could investigate. So we were trying to figure out, what was a reasonably limited set of policy options to take a look at at the state level. Certainly one highlight coming out of this really is the notion that the actions of neighboring states are going to have potentially large impacts on surrounding states, regardless of what any particular state chooses to do. So it's not just a state's actions; it's really going to be the choices of the neighbors as well that are going to affect what goes on in terms of its generation costs. How these sort of play out are really going to depend on the size of the emissions rate credit markets or mass allowance markets. Some states that, like West Virginia, we mentioned, they would have difficulty meeting an emissions rate target by themselves. They're going to be certainly better off purchasing ERCs, from surrounding states. They'd be better off going with a mass approach in general, but things along those lines. We get to the point. One thing that I found helpful when I was trying to interpret the model results, so it's in the paper, is that taking a look at for each state under each set of conditions, are they sort of importing or exporting ERCs or allowances? Obviously, if they're exporting ERCs and allowances, then they're in a pretty good position in terms of being able to meet the policy goal and still be willing to sell stuff to surrounding states. If they're purchasing them, then they're obviously having a bit tougher time. And it certainly was helpful to take a look at some of those trade flows in ERCs and mass allowances to figure out some of these benefits and costs that you see down at the state level. Just generally, keep in mind when we're looking through this stuff, these prices are pretty low and zero potentially in some years, the early years and in some of the out years, but they depend on the scope of the market. If you do have a situation in some of the cases we'll see where ERC prices are particularly low in some states, if you have only states that are well positioned to supply ERCs, in the ERC market, then prices are going to be low, but that would then obviously encourage other states to choose an emissions rate-based approach to take advantage of those low ERC prices. Those low prices do have some implications for incentives for renewables and the ability of the leakage provisions in the model to actually have an effect in that the mass cap over the existing units. So this graph shows the trade in either imports or exports in ERCs for the case where all the states aside from California and Reggie choose to go with the dual rate approach. So like you can see where Texas has a large positive number, that's Texas building a lot of wind units and exporting those ERCs to the rest of the country. You see the same sort of thing for South Carolina, whereas neighboring Georgia, even though they have some under construction nuclear, is still importing ERCs. And you can see that, like we mentioned, West Virginia is importing almost 40 terawatt hours of ERCs in 2030 to meet the policy emissions rate goals under this approach. So this sort of generally gives you some sense of which states are well positioned to go with perhaps an emissions rate-based approach. If they're exporting ERCs here, they're obviously producing them at comparatively low cost and selling them to other parts of the country. So now sort of trying to narrow the focus a bit and look at just the eastern half of the country, just to cut down on some of the amount of numbers. The main thing I want you to take away from these next few graphs is really this notion of we're starting to, most of the states in green are going with a mass cap over the existing units. And then the blue states, so this would be the states with the under construction nuclear plus New Jersey going with an emissions rate approach. So if that is just those 4 states doing an emissions rate approach amongst themselves and trading amongst themselves, the value of those ERCs is fairly low at $2.60 per megawatt hour in 2030, and I think it was actually 0 in most of the surrounding years. If you then expand the ERC market to include some of the western states that are supplying wind ERCs, the price of the ERCs actually goes up in that case, even though you still sort of have supplying states in this ERC market. That's because, well, number one, generating the ERCs from the wind costs a bit more than it did for, generating ERCs from some of the under construction nuclear plants in the 3 southeast states. And you do, whenever you have a positive price for any of these things, you have some states, even within that set of blue states, that are purchasing ERCs rather than sort of generating them at home.
Ryan, can you expand on why certain states like Georgia and Iowa that one might think have a lot of ERCs might be purchasing or have positive costs in this patchwork scenarios?
Positive cost or positive ERC prices?
Positive ERC prices.
It may be both, I don't recall. Well, it's a function of maybe too many things to go into here directly, but Georgia in particular is purchasing ERCs. I mean, they're really needing more than they're getting out of just the under construction nuclear, so they're having to take some additional actions. There are, some differences in state, growth in electricity demand, which would also factor into which states would be more inclined to, buy ERCs or allowances versus sell them. It also is a function of, is one state or another, better positioned to, do they have more wind resources? Do they have, any solar PV that might go in? Is it more or less effective than it is in other states? There are also sort of, in the model, regional differences in capital costs, taken from the NEMS model, similar to IPM, where different parts of the regions have, some variation in those capital costs. So there's quite a wide range of factors leading into, what really leads a state like Georgia in particular to need to purchase ERCs. But, at the end of the day, they're not producing, or in some sense, it's cheaper for them to buy the ERCs than it is to generate them at home, and they don't have enough sitting around for free to prevent them from going out and buying them in the ERC markets. Then if we bring in the Southeast for starters, you see, so that's sort of taken, so before you only really had, in some sense, states that you might expect to be supplying ERCs in the market, even though obviously, some states are within this group buying ERCs. If you bring in more states that you would expect that would be potentially demanding ERCs in the Southeast, you can see that it does, take the price from $4.60 per megawatt hour up to, $7.50 per megawatt hour. So that it is, as you expand that market of states in the emissions rate zone, it does, drive up the demand. So that would be, in some sense, the surrounding Southeast states purchasing more ERCs from, largely the wind-producing states in the plains. I think Georgia is actually still purchasing ERCs in this scenario, but probably fewer of them. I don't recall exactly. If, in contrast, you had the states in the sort of the east central region choosing to go with a rate-based approach, again, you get a somewhat similar effect on the ERC price, basically, where those surrounding states, in particular West Virginia, is purchasing those ERCs. And that was compared with the Southeast, it's a bit lower ERC price.
So Martin, we had a question here. To what extent in these scenarios are states like Kentucky and West Virginia driving those ERC prices as kind of the big purchasers in the region?
I would have to take a look at the table. Kentucky is probably a fairly large purchaser. Let me have a table up on my moment. Well, it's going to take a bit too long to. Table 3, it looks like in the paper, would have more of the details on purchases and sales of the ERCs. But yeah, you would have particular states that are sort of driving those prices up, and obviously, if it's one particular state needing to buy those ERCs, then you might end up with a somewhat different outcome than this. All states in the region choose to enter into an emissions rate scheme. It could be more states than, doing more picking and choosing than we sort of, we're able to take a look at here. This is, definitely trying to narrow down the potential range of possibilities in terms of, each determining, what is the absolute best outcome for each individual state. That would be, like I said, hard to do anyway, because you can sort of see in the policy cost results that one of the big drivers for policy cost for a state really is what the surrounding states do. So it's, an individual state is not necessarily going to be able to choose in isolation what might ideally lead to its lowest cost. But you do see that, like was mentioned in the question, for West Virginia in particular, West Virginia in this scheme would be the big purchaser of ERCs, and you might at some point want to go back and run a scenario where they are not, in the ERC market if they're unlikely to be going with an emissions rate approach. But in the interest of time, we didn't run all the possibilities. And then this was taking a look at nationally if most of the East, aside from Reggie, chose to go with an emissions rate approach in blue, that would get the ERC price up around $15 per megawatt hour as you brought in some additional states that needed to purchase those ERCs. And that would be actually getting to a point where you would be, doing more to, that would provide more of a subsidy to the wind units and whatnot, and encourage more renewable generation at those prices than you saw at some of the particularly low prices of $2 or $4 per megawatt hour. And I should mention that I guess both Reggie and California, given these low gas prices, are sort of meeting those emissions, the new source complement cap, without taking additional actions, not factoring in any sort of lower bounds that their policies would set on emissions rate or allowance prices within the states. So then, jumping into some of the policy costs that go along with those emissions trading schemes. Just for starters, hard to compare, I guess, all the way back to the national coordinated policy where everyone was doing the mass cap over the existing units in the light green. But here you can see where some states have chosen to, the 3 states that have chosen to go with the rate-based approach here, 2 of them end up, decently better off. New Jersey and South Carolina are sort of both selling, fairly cheap ERCs, but they are selling ERCs into largely Georgia and I think a little bit into Tennessee. I may be wrong on the Tennessee thing, but anyway, so you can see where they're sort of benefiting from selling those ERCs, and Georgia has some, small cost increase largely associated with purchasing those ERCs. And then, the other states, there's some tables in the paper that would help you do a comparison, like sort of state by state, might be table 4 or 5, and there's some stuff in the appendix as well. If you really wanted to go through, like, what happens to North Carolina when South Carolina chooses to go with an emissions rate approach instead of coordinating on a mass cap. Some of the tables in the paper would allow you to pick out those stories a bit easier than this graphical approach, but I didn't want to toss quite that many numbers at people, considering how many numbers I'm already tossing into the presentation. But you can pull that type of information out of the paper, and so I would just sort of broadly say that again, the point being that, what South Carolina or whoever chooses to do is going to affect the neighbors, and you'll see that in some of the results on the paper. So here you can see, then if you move into some of the plain states producing things, you can see where like South Carolina, benefited more when the ERC markets were more limited, a decline in cost of 1.7%, and a somewhat smaller benefit if there are other states selling into those ERC markets as well. But that, again, is affected by what goes on in the surrounding states. And you can see where, costs in, some of the plain states have gone down. Some of the plain states costs have actually gone up when they join this emissions rate approach. So that would, to some extent, indicate that maybe they actually would not be inclined to jump into these markets if you were talking about fairly limited ERC markets and fairly cheap ERC prices. They might actually not be inclined to jump into these markets, and the same would be obviously true for all of the other states, as they evaluate what's going on here. Then if we bring in some of the southeast states, can sort of see Kentucky was better off under a match approach than if they join an emissions rate approach. Their costs have gone from 1% to 3.6%. So you could essentially take from that they might lean against going with an emissions rate approach, assuming again that we're sort of thinking about these costs and choices from a state perspective and not necessarily a utility perspective cutting across these state boundaries. Certainly the utilities, I would strongly imagine, would prefer a consistent approach across service territories. And if you moved into the East Central region, again, if you compare, again, West Virginia is really the big changer. They are potentially somewhat better off, actually, under an emissions cap approach, where they're, in some sense, purchasing fairly cheap allowances at this case, and also potentially purchasing some electricity from neighbors that, at prices that are lower than they would have seen before. That is certainly not the case when you move into an emissions rate approach, where both West Virginia, West Virginia is certainly the big loser there. Some of the other states in that general PJM region might be potentially better off under an emissions rate approach, but that would assume that, again, that they're sort of buying relatively cheap ERCs in this scenario of whatever was $6.6 per megawatt hour. We are running low on time. This graph then sort of fills out that comparative thing where if all the states in the eastern side of the country decided to go with an emissions rate approach, and the ERC price is now up around $15 per megawatt hour, and that's where you really get into certainly bigger variation in terms of winners and losers. And obviously you're not, I don't think, going to see that in the real world, but this would give you some sense for, again, which states might potentially be inclined to go one route versus the other in terms of rate versus mass.
Martin, we're looking at those costs for the mass over existing only. That includes the EPA from the proposed model trading rule, the output-based allocation, and the renewable set aside to mitigate leakage. Is that correct?
Yes, that includes EPA's definitions of the amount of allowances that have to be set aside for those leakage provisions. The thing is, if I could, I can't really easily jump out all the way back to the graph that sort of showed the allowance prices that go along with those, but you can see where, the allowance prices of, $4 or $5 per ton, that just doesn't generate a whole lot of value to sort of engage in those, leakage activities. So that's why, so those costs are rolled in there, but they're, they're not a big player. And again, yeah, so those costs would be in there, and any costs associated with, like within the green states here, some states are purchasing allowances, some states are selling allowances to others in the trading area, and those sort of purchases and sales would also be factored into these state cost estimates. Well, let me very quickly go through some sensitivities, since quite a bit that could be said there, and there's quite a bit, again, in the paper that looks at a lot of these things and looks at some of the more, regional detail for some of the national approaches, and, a lot of tables looking at the sensitivity analyses, but just want to mention again broadly, for some of the natural gas sensitivities that we looked at, again, just keep in mind that the low gas prices are, really going to be, coming out of the coal generation, but they also do come out of any potential new renewable generation, whereas energy efficiency will come out of really gas generation and not the coal generation. One of the big things, if you have a rate-based policy and low gas prices, that really encourages quite a bit of gas generation, and you could look back at the leakage graph and see what exactly is going on there. The high gas prices potentially have the highest policy costs, and low gas prices would really get your policy costs for the Clean Power Plan close to zero. Electricity demand, that's really going to, higher than expected demand growth is going to be supplied by gas quite a bit, and it's going to make policies like the new source complement with a fixed cap on most all emissions more expensive than, some of the other options. For renewables energy efficiency, low renewables costs will make the dual emissions rate approach cheaper as the renewables generate additional ERCs, but that actually does lead to higher emissions. So you've got the more renewables because the costs are low for the renewables, but they generate ERCs that allow the coal plants to run more, and that leads to higher emissions. And again, that would be something you'd see in some of those leakage results. Low availability of energy efficiency is definitely going to make an emissions rate approach more expensive. And finally, just generally, just keep in mind that even if you're taking a look at sort of national policy costs that are fairly close to zero, you're going to see potentially a fairly wide range across states due to what their existing generation fleet is, differences in gas prices around the country, differences in the costs and effectiveness of the renewables, demand growth, all those kinds of things are really going to play in at the state level and give you much more variation than you see at a regional or national level. And, things are really just not always going to move in the direction you expect, and it's going to depend quite a bit on what your neighbors do, and, the costs are going to be shifted sort of across state borders as electricity generation sort of shifts around in response to these different state choices. Didn't really go into it, but you can see certainly situations where if one state goes rate and a neighboring state goes mass, generation may be inclined to shift into the emissions rate state and out of the mass state, and that's going to shift those policy costs around in response to that kind of adjustment as well. And I think that was it, since I'm out of time anyway.